What is your opinion between culture and poverty?
What do you mean? What's that mean?
Like, do you think there's a link between culture and poverty?
A correlation, you
Yeah,
mean?
correlation.
So in other words, are you asking, does culture cause poverty?
Mm.
Cultural values?
Mm.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think it certainly creates oppression. So, in my time working in Nepal, we had several examples of where particularly women, I think, in society are oppressed. So, whether that creates poverty in itself, I think that, there are traditions, for instance, superstitions, that are in some of the tribal peoples of Nepal, where to test, for instance, as an example, whether a woman has been faithful to her husband, at the end of 1 year of marriage, there is a burning ceremony, and the woman's knee is essentially branded, and if the scarring that comes up becomes a bubble, then it suggests, through the kind of the shame and the superstitious sort of analysis of the situation, that the woman has been unfaithful to her husband. Yeah. So by that, what I mean is that there is some, not all, but some cultural traditions which are designed specifically to, in particular cultures, benefit one social class more than another, or one group of people, whether that's men over women or high caste over low caste, which then means that these things get in the way in society as a whole. My wife worked for an organisation called Dalit Seva Sangha, and the Dalit people are the untouchables of southern Nepal, northern India, and by untouchables that means that in certain villages, you wouldn't, for instance, want to share the same tap with those individuals. So that then means that the poverty-laden conditions that many people are living in are made worse by those cultural values, and in particular, I think the fact that certain jobs are not available to Dalits, to untouchables, for no other reason than, from what I can see, religious and cultural kind of combined. So it's the way it's always been. If you're a Brahmin, you get certain benefits in society, and if you're a Dalit, then you have certain disadvantages, and that's always the way it's been. So in terms of entrepreneurial initiatives and perhaps supporting ideas for businesses, well, a lot of young Dalit minds, they're not getting the schooling, they're not being allowed access to the kind of knowledge that might be able to pull them out of poverty. So I think society is entrenched in those values, which therefore creates poverty perhaps where there doesn't necessarily need to be. And you could have more social mobility where people from one class can move out of that and into the sort of higher echelons of society, and they're being prevented from doing that, I think, by the values and traditions that are embedded in certain types of cultures.
Okay, so what are some common misconceptions about poverty?
I think first of all that there is a sense that for many who are living in poor conditions, that there is a sort of authenticity of experience there. When you look at the way in my subject area, for instance, in film and media, the way that poverty is often presented, there's a couple of things. First of all, it creates stereotypes. It creates stereotypes about the way in which people act in conditions of poverty. Sometimes they're positive stereotypes, so they're things like, that there's an authenticity of experience, which means, that there are these engrounded sort of working class values in people, which I think, nobody wants to be poor, nobody chooses to be poor. It's the prevailing social conditions and sociological, I think, reasons that mean that people are placed in poverty. The importance of what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in other words, if people are born into poverty and then they are labelled as poor, and then the experiences that have led them into that poverty in the first place perhaps relates to the fact that perhaps there's only mum at home, dad's left, it was a child that was born perhaps out of wedlock when the mother was very young. There isn't what we call, the Marxist sociologist Bourdieu calls the cultural capital at home to be able to break out of that experience. So in other words, You'll have the vocabulary, the language with which to present yourself. You'll have been educated and socialised through secondary socialisation at school to have the values and be able to say the kind of things that are expected of you to get into university, to get a good job, etc. If you're poor and you've been brought up in those conditions, then quite often you see school as the enemy, because of the culture that you're brought up in, where the teachers are seen as, out to get you. They're part of a autocratic regime that's trying to stop you from having fun or whatever it might be. You're more likely to fall into problems of drugs, prostitution, alcohol addiction, and these are all part of the same, what we call in sociology, cycle of deprivation. So you're born into a poor family, you take on those values, you don't have the capital with which to get out, you don't even see education as your way out, which means you end up having and repeating the same problems as your parents, where you end up, perhaps getting pregnant early, having children before you're ready, before you're able to economically support them, and therefore there is a cycle of poverty which is created by the fact that kids are born, they don't have particularly great experiences in the family, they don't have access to a way out of that situation, which then creates that same sort of cycle.
Do you feel empathy towards people in poverty?
Yes,
And
of
if
course.
so, why?
Because I don't think it's their fault. I don't think anyone asked to be born poor any more than you asked to be born rich. I think that you are the sort of total makeup of your genes and your cultural experience. So it's you're biologically determined in terms of what you're going to do in life, but you're also, I think, culturally determined, because you take on the values of the culture that you're born into. If you're born into a poor family situation, the chances are you're never going to know anything other than that, because no one's ever going to teach you or show you another way. You're just going to see people who live on the hill up there in a much bigger house than you, but it doesn't mean to say that you would know how to get there yourself. So empathy suggests that you can understand what those people are going through. I think empathy rather than sympathy, because I've been poor before, but I've never lived in poverty. I've never worried about where my next meal's coming from, for instance. Whereas to empathise with somebody means that you can try and imagine yourself in their shoes, and I think that's a really important thing to do. Otherwise, nobody would ever give to charities. You have to understand, or try to understand what people are experiencing, and try to imagine what their lives must be. And there are so many people in the world who I think are affected by the economic systems that we've employed, which continue to see the rich grow, ever richer, but ever more vast figures of people living in poverty too. So I think it's one of the most heartbreaking problems that we face in the current world, partly through overpopulation, partly through cultural norms, and I think, as I say, partially through the capitalist system that we've adopted almost worldwide, which allows, on the one hand, one person to own an island, whilst you have, in sections of Hong Kong society, whole families having to cram into one room of a flat and living in very difficult circumstances. So I have a lot of empathy, I think, for people who are going through those kind of tough times.
And what do you think is the basic needs to survive in comparison with developing countries?
Well, you probably know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Have you heard that one before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think physiologically, that's the first thing. If you're living in poverty, then what you're worried about is your physical needs. Food, drink. Poverty quite often goes hand in hand with drought. People have no food to eat, or there are limited water resources. So I think that they are the most important needs to cover. I mean, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, then once your physiological needs are met, then the next thing that you worry about when you're poor is your safety. Yeah. And if you're living in a shanty town, for instance, with a tin house, then you don't exactly have the best security in the world. Anyone can break into your house at any point and steal from you. Not that you've necessarily got very much to have stolen, but I think that they're the first two things. I think in the developed world, we worry about what people think of us and our self-esteem, and we want to be loved, and we want to, go out there and we want to be successful in our careers, and we want to make a name for ourselves and perhaps have a legacy. I don't think that's the case if you're living in poverty. I think you're just worried about, as I say, where your next meal's going to come from.